The abandoned mansion at the edge of Chhalava village had stood empty for decades, its crumbling walls and shattered windows serving as a constant reminder of the dark events that had unfolded within its cursed halls. Locals refused to speak about what happened there, their faces going pale and their voices dropping to hushed whispers whenever someone dared to mention the old forsaken house that loomed over the village like a shadow of death itself. My name is Arjun, and I never believed in ghost stories or supernatural nonsense until that fateful night when my friends and I decided to explore the Chhalava mansion on a dare that would change our lives forever. We were young, stupid, and full of the kind of reckless courage that only comes from ignorance about the true horrors that exist in the darkest corners of our world, where evil lurks, waiting for foolish souls to stumble into its grasp. It was a cold October evening when the five of us gathered at the rusted iron gates that marked the boundary of the cursed property. The wind howled through the bare branches of dead trees that surrounded the mansion, creating an eerie symphony that should have warned us to turn back while we still had the chance. But we laughed off our nervousness, convincing ourselves that we were brave adventurers about to debunk silly village superstitions and prove that there was nothing to fear in the abandoned house. Raj was the first to push open the creaking gate, the sound of metal scraping against metal echoing through the night like the wail of a dying animal. Maya followed close behind, her phone's flashlight cutting through the thick darkness that seemed to swallow the light as quickly as it appeared. Behind them came Deepak and Priya, holding hands as they nervously joked about ghost hunting and horror movies, their laughter sounding hollow and forced in the oppressive silence that surrounded us. I brought up the rear, a camera in my hand to document our adventure and prove to everyone back in the city that we had actually gone through with this crazy dare. The path leading to the mansion was overgrown with twisted vines and thorny bushes that seemed to reach out and grab at our clothes as we passed, as if the very vegetation was trying to hold us back from making the biggest mistake of our lives. The mansion itself was even more imposing up close than it had appeared from the village. 3 stories of decay and rot stretched upward into the night sky, with broken balconies hanging precariously from their supports, and sections of the roof completely collapsed inward. The front door hung open on broken hinges, revealing nothing but impenetrable darkness beyond the threshold that seemed to pulse with an almost living malevolence. We stood at the entrance for several long moments, each of us silently reconsidering our decision, but none willing to be the first to suggest turning back and facing the mockery of our friends. Finally, Raj took a deep breath and stepped across the threshold into the mansion, and one by one the rest of us followed him into the belly of that cursed place where countless souls had met their terrible ends. The interior was worse than I could have imagined. The smell of mold and decay was overwhelming, mixed with something else that I could not quite identify, but made my stomach churn with instinctive revulsion. Our flashlights revealed walls covered in peeling wallpaper that depicted scenes of pastoral beauty now corrupted by years of water damage and neglect, creating nightmarish images of distorted faces and twisted figures that seemed to watch our every move. The floorboards groaned ominously under our feet as we made our way deeper into the mansion, exploring room after room filled with the remnants of lives long abandoned. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floors, covered in thick layers of dust that had not been disturbed in decades. Portraits hung crooked on the walls, their subjects' eyes seemingly following us as we passed, their painted faces twisted into expressions of silent, screaming agony. It was Maya who first noticed something was wrong. She stopped suddenly in the middle of what appeared to be a grand dining room, her flashlight frozen on a spot near the far wall. When we asked what she had seen, her voice trembled as she described a shadow that had moved independently of our lights, darting from one corner of the room to another with impossible speed that defied all natural explanation. We tried to laugh it off as tricks of the light and overactive imaginations, but the seed of genuine fear had been planted in our minds and was already beginning to grow roots that would soon strangle our courage completely. As we continued our exploration, more strange occurrences began to happen with increasing frequency and intensity that made it impossible to maintain our skepticism. Doors that we had left open would be found closed when we returned to rooms we had already explored. Footsteps echoed from the floors above us when we were certain we were alone in the building. Cold spots appeared randomly throughout the mansion, dropping the temperature so suddenly that our breath became visible in clouds of condensation that hung in the air like ghosts themselves. Deepak suggested we leave. His earlier bravado completely evaporated in the face of phenomena that our rational minds could not explain away. But when we tried to retrace our steps to the entrance, we found ourselves hopelessly lost in a maze of corridors and rooms that seemed to shift and change when we were not looking directly at them, as if the mansion itself was alive and determined to keep us trapped within its walls forever. Panic began to set in as we wandered through the labyrinthian interior, each hallway looking identical to the last, and every room blending together in a disorienting blur of decay and darkness. Priya started crying, convinced that we were going to die in this horrible place, just like whoever had lived here before us, their spirits still trapped and suffering in an eternal nightmare from which there was no escape. That is when we heard the voice. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once, a whisper that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. At first, we could not make out the words, but as the voice grew louder and more insistent, we began to understand what it was saying, and the message it conveyed filled us with a terror so profound that several of us collapsed to our knees in paralyzed fear. The voice spoke of vengeance and suffering, of innocent blood spilled on these floors, and souls condemned to wander these halls for eternity. It told us that we were not the first foolish intruders to enter the Chhalava mansion uninvited, and that all who came before us had paid the ultimate price for their curiosity and disrespect. Now it was our turn to join the countless spirits trapped within these cursed walls, to become part of the mansion's eternal collection of tormented souls. As the voice spoke, the temperature in the mansion dropped even further, until frost began forming on the walls, and our breaths came out in icy clouds. The shadows around us grew darker and more substantial, taking on vaguely human shapes that moved with predatory grace as they circled us like wolves preparing to attack their cornered prey. Raj grabbed my arm and pulled me toward what he swore was the direction of the entrance, but as we ran through the darkened corridors with the shadow figures in pursuit, we found ourselves in a part of the mansion we had definitely not explored before. This section was even more deteriorated than the rest, with large holes in the floors revealing darkness that seemed to extend far deeper than the mansion's foundation should allow. We burst through a doorway and found ourselves in what appeared to be a ballroom, its once grand chandelier now hanging by a single chain and swaying gently despite the complete absence of any breeze. In the center of the room stood a figure dressed in the tattered remains of what must have once been expensive formal wear. The figure's back was to us, but as we entered the room, it slowly began to turn, revealing a face that would haunt my nightmares for the rest of my life. Where eyes should have been were empty sockets that somehow still seemed to stare directly into our souls. The mouth hung open in a silent scream, revealing darkness within that seemed to go on forever. The skin was gray and papery,